Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support.
Today's talk is on the root causes of violent radicalization, the Terror Contagion Hypothesis. I want to give credit to Oleg Pavlov, Bland Addison, and Khalid Saeed, who are part of my advisory committee and deeply involved in this effort for part of my dissertation. The historical debate on the root causes of radicalization in terrorism can be distilled as two hypotheses: swarm and fisherman. And this may sound fairly academic, hypotheses, funny names, but it has a very real impact. And if we think about what those are, if I read the chart left to right, the key elements, and then how each swarm and fisherman deal with this violent radicalization. And we're talking about terrorism. Radicalization that leads someone to want to kill them, as many people as they can, possibly themselves. So where does this radicalization come from? This is called the debate of root causes. The swarm hypothesis is that local conditions and loose networks of individuals in their own area drive the radicalization. The fisherman hypothesis is that organized non-state actors are the ones entering into that space from perhaps a foreign area and causing that radicalization to occur. Now, this becomes very important when you think about these hypotheses. What's the primary risk? If you swarm hypothesis, that's homegrown terrorism. And if it's fisherman hypothesis, this may be a group like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the ones we hear in the news all the time. And where I tie this to how it matters in the last 20 years in the global war of terror is, depending on this hypothesis, you have two very different policy reactions in the national security space of how you're going to confront the risk of terrorism. In the swarm hypothesis, if it's a local manifestation, a local phenomenon, you're going to prioritize local communities to identify and disable these networks. But if you're operating under the fisherman hypothesis, you're going to look to the areas where the foreign non-state actors are and go there where they intervene. And all of a sudden, this becomes clear when we talk about fight them over there versus fighting them here. We begin to see the manifestations of this policy difference: billions and billions of dollars of research and effort, hundreds of thousands of lives impacted over vast continents. So this is a very real debate. And we entered this debate to try and see if we could pick the winner or identify who had more. This has been going on in the terrorism space for about 15, 20 years now. And what we first found is when we did statistical analysis across a very broad set of terror incidents. So this paper is up on SSRN. 4,600 terror incidents in the Western Europe and United States, both completed and failed. We looked across it. We did a lot of research. We couldn't find any really strong confidence in either hypothesis. We did not find good support. And this was the first comprehensive look. There have been lots of case studies of sort of selected incidents and sort of case reviews, but this was a very comprehensive across a variety of different ideologies. We couldn't find good support for either, which led us to think, as system dynamicists, right? What if swarm and fishermen are not the causes of the system, but the byproducts of the system? This leads to a system structure analysis, which is going to be the basic of the talk today. This causal loop diagram, in the paper that's online, we go through exhaustively, link by link, building it up with citations. This is not our causal loop diagram that we built of our good ideas. This is synthesizing the theories and research of dozens of papers, data sets, efforts, combining forensic evidence, empirical evidence, statistical reviews, psychological. It all brings it together. We're not trying to create a causal loop diagram of our mental model, but rather the combined mental model. If you combined all these theorists together, what would that system look like? And what can that tell us about the root cause? So I'm not going to go through the loop in detail because it's in the paper, but I want to do the big chunks. The first is a growth of radicalization, and there are different variations of this. It's a step process, or it's a phase process, or it's emergence. There's multiple different steps, but essentially it's a positive feedback loop that as someone gets on the path of violent radicalization, they move through more stages, and then they commit terrorism, which generates societal responses. This is the growth cycle. This is a growth loop. But a key part of that growth loop in the literature is the network structure. Where are they getting their influences from? Is it from those local folks? Is it from non-state actors? So we began mapping out the network structure. Again, I'm not going to go through every single element in this. In the paper, it's built up link by link, but these are the group network dynamics of the radicalizing network. We're talking about how you get involved with self-selection bias, illusion of numbers, group cohesion dynamics, all of these interesting influence dynamics play effect in the network and create this system structure, which ultimately creates a positive feedback loop. The more exposure to radicalizing content you have, the higher risk of radicalization. It's countered, on the other hand, by an exactly symmetrical moderating influence network. So you have some complicated diagram, lots of loops. We can go through the paper and see where each one of these come from. But we know as system scientists that if all we have is a bunch of positive loops, we can reduce that to two opposing positive loops and get to a success to the successful archetype. And the core of this network structure was reduced to success to the successful. If you are in an area where you get, because of algorithmic sorting and social media and the way the networks generate today, if you start out with a predominance of radicalizing influence in your network, generally speaking, in aggregate over time, you're going to become more exposed to that. Likewise, if you do moderating. So this success to the successful loop, we then located in the network effects of the growth cycle. So we have the positive, we just simply move it in. We provide some links. And what we have here now is a representation of the swarm hypothesis. This structure with network effects, homegrown network effects, a growth structure of how people become radicalized and commit terrorism, this encapsulates or subsumes the swarm hypothesis. Everything you need to explain terrorism in the swarm hypothesis is here. But we didn't want to just create the swarm hypothesis. We wanted to look across all the theories. So we began adding to this growth cycle by adding an ungoverned space. Now, this is a key term. In the first part of the global war of terror, governed space and ungoverned space could be a proxy for domestic, our country versus a foreign country that has low stability, things like that. But over time, this has shifted. It's not just a foreign physical location. It might be an online location. An ungoverned space today might be 8chan or 4chan. It could also emerge spontaneously within a governed space for a very short period of time where the authorities are not able to conduct normal law enforcement. So you talk about, and these are US examples, but for example, the standouts of the ranches in Nevada or the Mahler wildlife refugee crisis, autonomous zones, January 6th, these can be very short ungoverned areas within which people come to and then have a service here. The Fisherman Hypothesis is that from these ungoverned spaces, non-state actors are influencing the domestic space. So again, it's built in the paper loop by loop, but think of this as people from the outside, whether it's virtual or physical foreign, they're moving in cultural scripts, broadcasting a narrow script. They're sending in the information that's going to radicalize the folks in that domestic space. This is the Fisherman Hypothesis. So right here, we have the swarm and the fisherman represented fairly well. But we wanted an endogenous system. We didn't want to have a bunch of hanging arrows out there and exogenous effects. So we went through the literature and added in what makes this a complete cycle. Obviously, when terrorism happens, 9/11, the classic case, there's going to be an intervention response. Now, here we didn't model intervention as a specific time, but we did model it as going into the ungoverned space. And when you do an intervention into the ungoverned space, you may provoke something called the accidental guerrilla syndrome. This is a theory by Kukulin, which describes how by intervening into an area, you can cause people to come against you who normally wouldn't. Again, the literature goes through this. I'm not going to go into detail, but what I'm showing here is two things. One, this is not our ideas. The system structure is all we added to this. We're simply bringing this together in a cohesive structure. But two, you can begin to see the dynamics that have played out. 9/11 happens, we go into Afghanistan, there's an accidental guerrilla response, and the Taliban goes from having a few thousand in 2002 to 20,000, 40,000, 80,000, it begins growing. We also added the final connective tissue to show the physical movement of people who might move to a conflict zone. If you create a conflict zone or one exists, people might be drawn to that. And again, these conflict zones, and Syria is a great example of this. Syria drew in individuals who then, when they left Syria, came back. But this also happens in these temporary spaces. If you went to January 6th, you made connections, you got notoriety, you got prestige, you broadcasted yourself, you may be under criminal investigation, but then you go back to your main areas. This back and forth between governed and ungoverned space is a very important dynamic. And finally, we added the part that was not mentioned as much was the cultural scripts, which we simply said unit of measure consistency, right? How do people influence? The mechanism, the material with which this influence happens, we call cultural scripts. These could be videos, manifestos, idiomatic phrases, memes, GIFs. I mean, it's all the material that we talk about, abstracted symbolic language, all the variety that can come in. Now, this model, we were looking at what is the root cause. So we used a complex causal analysis method that I am actually going to talk about in a session immediately following this one, and that's 302, but it will be online. Complex causation, we looked at that. You take the CLD, you flip it vertically, and you begin to see what the top-down and bottom-up causations are. So you flip the CLD, and when you do that, you find out that there is a top-down social contagion that looks a lot like the Werther effect. Werther effect, when a celebrity commits suicide, it spreads through the cultural scripts across the population. The high-risk population then that is self-similar, a smaller group, begins replicating that, and they're at risk of suicide. And it only lasts for about 2 weeks. When we do this, the terror contagion hypothesis, we took those top-down few root causes that we found in our testing, isolated them, and we said a template ideology or method spread by cultural scripts, self-similarity, notoriety, coherent. They then spread to a high-risk population which shares at-risk factors, social culture. It activates a mammalian adaptation to commit predatory violence. This is something that humans have as an evolutionary adaptation. That leads to predatory mass violence. And that results in a new round of violence, which spreads more cultural scripts. The media is reacting to fatalities, and that completes the contagion, and it cycles again. The Werther contagion only lasts, it gains attention because of celebrity, and only lasts for a few weeks because no one else who commits suicide is a celebrity. But the terror contagion hypothesis, the notoriety comes from the fatalities, not from the individual. And subsequent terror incidents generate their own notoriety. This is why it can go on for decades at a time, because it can have long periods of time between subsequent events. What are some examples of this? Well, we have two that we look at in particular: the Columbine-style school shooting contagion and great replacement theory of white nationalist terror contagion. Columbine begins in 1999 with a very distinctive attack and goes through many incidents over time. Over 70 people have replicated the Columbine style, some of whom were born after that event happened. The great replacement theory white nationalist terror contagion begins in Norway in 2011 with Breivik's attack and is replicated in all of these different attacks, including the Charleston church shooting, the Christchurch mosque attack in New Zealand. 4 synagogues in 2019 are part of this contagion, including Halle here in Germany, El Paso, a grocery store in Texas, and Hanau, Germany in 2020, even here in 2022. Just in the last few weeks as preparing this, Buffalo is a clear link to this great replacement. Uvalde seems like, we don't know for sure, but it seems like a replication of the Columbine style. This does lead, like good scientists, we want to have experiments, we want to have predictions. These are some of the predictions that we can test. We're going to be doing some experiments on them. I'm going to not, these are again referenced in the paper, but this theory leads to testable, provable experiments that could either confirm or deny what our thoughts are. So this is the current work here. This is half of my dissertation is on this. So there are 4 papers of this, and again, you can take a screenshot. The benefit analysis of what this would mean from policy implications under the premise this is correct. But we're not stopping here. This is the agenda we're taking forward. We want to continue the research by shifting from that structuralist perspective of system structure and hypothesis into an empiricist perspective of how do we test this? How do we validate this? How do we build confidence in this? Take those data sets we build, continue them, make them available online, provide them to researchers, enhance them. But we're also looking to apply this. We currently are working on a proposal. Well, we've submitted the proposal. We're waiting to hear back from the Department of Justice. We're working with the Department of Homeland Security. We're willing to work with other law enforcements. This is an early stage hypothesis. This is not something you want to go out and implement, but we're looking to do continued research, working with law enforcement, and then aim towards getting towards a pilot program. And finally, build awareness of this, since this is an area of concern. We want to make sure that there is an understanding and a dialogue. The traditional debate, it's moved back and forth over time, but a lot of times when folks think about terrorism, they're looking at the physical aspects or the tangibles. This system view is a little bit unusual, so we're going to have to do some effort to build awareness in the community, both of practitioners, academics, and the general public. The good news, as I finish, we're not starting from scratch. The Werther contagion effect of celebrity suicides has been investigated and studied and well proven over 20 years. All we're saying is if that's true there, be open to the thought it may be true here. And the root cause of radicalization may be a system driven by social contagion rather than swarm or hypothesis. So that's where I'll pause and see if there are any questions.
Are there any questions in the room first?
So you, I might have just misunderstood this, but I think you mentioned that your systems model led you to study your model of contagion effects. Right? Could you just go over that a little bit more in detail? Like you mentioned that you went with the compound factors and things like that.
How did the blinding flash of insight or the causal analysis?
Just like how is the system model related to contagion?
So in the next session that I'm at in modeling, we go through that in more detail, how you do a causal analysis. You can do top-down factors and bottom-up factors in that vertical hierarchy. That helps you isolate causal factors. And once we isolated them, we began looking at, is this similar to anything else? And that's where we saw that it was very similar to social contagion broadly, and then began looking within social contagions, and it became very similar to the Werther effect very quickly.
Could you repeat the question, Tim, in the future, for future questions?
Yeah, the question there was, how did we get from system structure to contagion?
We have one question from David Ling.
Hi, Tim. Thanks for that. I'm hoping to make your later session. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's not a question. I noticed the Werther effect. Are you aware that you are in the city of the man who wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther?
Yes, I am, but I wasn't going to bring that up due to time limitations.
Okay, you should go. You should go visit the Goethe house. It's wonderful.
I'll take a selfie.
Okay, I'll leave it. I'll leave it there. Thanks. Gotta go.
Tim, do you have
Jim, we've got a question in the room here.
what's that?
We've got a question in the room.
Got it.
Okay, so my question is more on the methodology and use of CODs than it's on the content. So what I see in the model is that there are different types of terrorist acts, right? So you might have someone included by the swarm methodology, you might have someone being included by an organization, and you depict them in the same model, right? If you look at a certain case, certain dynamics of your model might play a role in one, but not in the other. Right, and then there's also the bottom-up and top-down causality. So there might be some factors in your model that are very that have to do with the societal level, and there might be very individual factors as well. And in the COD, we mix all of these together. Right, your COD is actually telling many different stories depending on where you look in the model. So, and I noticed that in our models as well. So my question is going to be: should we incorporate all of this in one COD when, in fact, when you look at a single case, half of this COD might not be relevant for one case, and the other half be relevant for another.
Let me repeat and summarize for those.
The
question is, if a COD incorporates many different kinds of behavior, how can you distinguish if one case is not as applicable as the other, and should they be combined, or is that a risk? And the answer is, we didn't stop with a CLD. We did a simulation which specifically tested those contingencies you're talking about. So the CLD is a hypothesis. This is what we think might be going on, but then we built a simulation that tests the contingencies, something like 26 different contingency factors, to see what were the ranges of those contingencies where it would apply or would not apply. And we were able to falsify and say, under these conditions, the contagion would not occur. Therefore, it is probably something else. So we didn't stop with the CLD, but went on to simulation. I think it's a good point, though. I would push back, though, that a system should be capable of generating many kinds of behavior. So a good system could generate many, but then you can't stop with that. To your point, it can create confusion. You have to then go and articulate which ones are valid or not valid within that specific model through more empirical methods. So I think that's a good point.
Good. So let's do, maybe if it is quick, then we can go to Jim and we'll start after that.
Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation. You mentioned that you work with law enforcement, and I was just wondering how you deal with the challenge of there being an overlap between the kind of white nationalist, white perspectives terrorism or violence that you talked about, and the fact that law enforcement can contribute to structural racism and things like police brutality.
So the question for repeat is, if we're working with law enforcement, how do we navigate the potential risk of law enforcement being parts of white nationalist group, and or the larger question of police contributions to structural racism? I'll break it down in two. We've actually brought this up in several environments to study the specific replication of social contagions within law enforcement communities that are receiving these messages and part of it. They're not excluded from it. They are potentially part of the population, and this would be a method to study that. So we have brought that up, but it's just conversation right now. On the larger question of structural, we are very careful in our policy tests. If you look at the policy paper, we are looking not to create inadvertent harm, a type 1 error where you can replicate a structural inequality because you've simply done too broad a policy. So it's a little tricky to get in the details of that, but when we did a lot of our policy testing, we're looking at what causes the least amount of harm inadvertently, what is reversible, and a lot of our policies don't even deal with incarceration. There's a specific method in violence reduction called focused deterrence, or pulling levers, that is designed to be non-incarceration for that exact reason, to avoid incarceration as the first go-to. Not that that's the perfect solution for structural, but it's sort of a harm mitigation effort in that policy. But that's in the policy paper.
Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.